Thank you, Dr. Warner, for joining the Live Ideas 2020 Summer Institute. The theme for this Summer Institute is It's the End of the World. And of course, we're not making light of the fact of recent events, but we're trying to find a way to creatively approach this particular subject. So, Dr. Warner, you're going to offer us a perspective kind of from your background as a political science professor and other kind of fields that you've engaged with on sort of the end of the world, the apocalypse, ways that the world can end, and all the issues involved in that. So, Dr. Warner, I'll give you the floor.
I thought about kind of approaching this topic in a variety of ways. And I, thought of I'll do a broad overview of this thing. A number of considerations dissuaded me from doing that, including the fact this is not a topic that I consider myself an expert in. And so rather than go, kind of start really big and then go down to kind of more particulars, I thought I would start with something that I know pretty well and that probably all of us at least have some familiarity with, and that's Machiavelli's Prince. So I thought we'd kind of start with a text, and then we could kind of broaden out from there. So I chose Machiavelli's Prince as a means of exploring the question of the end of the world, and in particular the question of the apocalypse or apocalyptic imaginaries, for a couple reasons, one of which I already mentioned, and that's that it's a text that we're all kind of at least broadly familiar with. And another reason is that this is maybe kind of an unlikely source for these kinds of ideas. We certainly don't associate Machiavelli with, with an apocalyptic worldview. We really, if we associate him with anything, we associate him with a worldly, a secular, even an amoral point of view, and we don't really picture him as someone who believes in a final judgment or in a cessation of historical time. Now, I should say at the beginning, I think that kind of broad view of Machiavelli is basically correct. So my intention is not to kind of correct that view. I don't think Machiavelli is some sort of apocalyptic, crypto-apocalyptic theorist. But I do think that he has to confront the problem of apocalypse in The Prince, if for no other reason than because many of his contemporaries did believe that a final judgment was coming, and it was coming soon. And what's really interesting, I think, is the way that expectation, the expectation of a final judgment and an imminent final judgment, that colors people's judgments. It changes their interpretations of current events in some really odd and some really interesting and some really politically destabilizing ways, right? So here's where I think, Machiavelli he's got to confront the apocalyptic imaginary, because it's something that affected people's judgments and perceptions of what they saw out there in the world. When lightning strikes a cathedral, it's not just a cause and effect. It's not a natural event. This is portentous. It's loaded with divine themes and symbolism, right? So with that kind of in the background, here is what I propose to do. I want to kind of do two things, all right? First, I want to look closely at the person of Gerolamo Savonarola. So Savonarola is a Dominican priest who rose to prominence during Machiavelli's time. He rose to prominence for criticizing the corruption of the church, and also criticizing kind of, cultural and political elites. All right, so he was a populist pastor and a real fire and brimstone guy. His sermons were absolutely thick with apocalyptic imagery and expectation, and much of it, as I kind of suggested before, a lot of the effect of his sermons was to delegitimize two of Machiavelli's own political opponents, although Savonarola predated Machiavelli by just a few years. So one of his targets was the Catholic Church and the Papal States. Those of you who have read The Prince know that Machiavelli is explicitly critical of the institutional Catholic Church in Rome, and he's critical of the Papal States as well. Well, Savonarola is very critical of the institutionalized church for its corruption, its selling of indulgences, so on and so forth. So one of his targets is the Catholic Church. Another of his targets is the Medici family, and in fact, Savonarola helped depose the Medicis in 1494. He fomented a lot of popular discontent and paved the way for the French invasion into Florence in 1494. And so the Medici family and the principality that they were, that they headed in Florence for about 60 years, they, of course, were political. They had a complex political relationship with Machiavelli, but Machiavelli was a member of the Florentine Republic, right? And so he was a advocate of republican governments, and so he was a kind of an opponent of the Medicis. So Machiavelli and Savonarola may not be friends, as we'll see, but they share enemies. And of course, one of the famous misattributions of Machiavelli, people think that he said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't know that he ever said that, but you sort of get the idea here that Machiavelli's got a complex relationship with Savonarola, even if it's a complex relationship that's at some distance. So I want to look at Savonarola, just his person, his rise to prominence, some of the rhetorical tropes on which he relied in his sermons. And then I want to kind of examine his relationship with Machiavelli. More specifically, I want to talk a little bit about Machiavelli's ambiguous treatment of Savonarola in The Prince. He only mentions Savonarola once. But I think the final chapter of The Prince is actually a kind of appropriation of some apocalyptic rhetorical tropes, and so we can maybe have a look at that and try and make sense of what the heck's going on, because that last chapter of The Prince is confusing for a lot of people, and I'm class myself among those who are confused. So let's talk about Savonarola for just a second, okay? Life and times, a little bit of context. As I mentioned, Savonarola was a Dominican friar, and he had preached pretty anonymously for about 3 years in Florence. He started rising to notoriety around 1485, and this is all on the heels of an apocalyptic vision that he had, or claimed to have at least, that told him that the church needed reforming, and that the Catholic Church would be scourged and renewed. So we have here, right from the very beginning, the emergence of a really important apocalyptic trope, right? Namely, God's eruption into secular time as an instrument of punishment and moral renewal, right? So God steps in to secular time, right? And he does so in order to punish the corrupt, to scourge the earth of its corruption and degradation, and create a groundwork for a renewed, more righteous world, right? So this is a very popular trope among apocalyptic pastors. You hear, we hear it now, right? Billy Graham, these kinds of people, talk about the imminence of a judgment. At any rate, right? So Savonarola was right in line with this kind of fire and brimstone approach. He preached that a divine judgment was close, that Florentines needed to repent or be punished, and he was very critical both of the church. He was very fond of associating Alexander VI, who was the Pope, He liked to, he characterized Alexander VI as the Antichrist. Alexander VI didn't necessarily love that and ended up excommunicating Savonarola a year before his death. But also he became very critical of the Medici, who of course they were the quote unquote prince in Florence at the time. They were Florence's ruling family. All right. So I want to call your attention just to give you a flavor of some of these sermons, right? You get the sense of how violent the imagery is, how chaotic he characterizes, how chaotic a place he characterizes the world to be. And this is all mixed up with prophecies about things that are to come. So you notice he says in one sermon, I think this is in the early 1490s, he says, "I am the hailstorm that shall break the heads of those who do not take shelter." Right? So this is, this is really violent, chaotic imagery. And you notice it kind of divides the world into two groups, right? There are people who take shelter and there are people who don't. And the people who don't take shelter, well, they're going to get their heads broken, right? So we have this kind of dividing of the world into those who repent and those who are in trouble, right? So this message of winners and losers, of this gets mixed up with prophecies or visions that he claims to have. So he talks about these in his sermons as well. The most significant or the most important political event in Savonarola's life was the invasion of Florence by Charles VIII, the French king. This happened in 1494. When they invaded Florence, they deposed the Medici family, and this created a republic, or it reestablished a republic. And of course, guess who was at the head of this ostensible republic? It was Savonarola himself. But at any rate, Savonarola was certainly patted himself on the back for predicting this political event. So he says, "Long before anyone had heard the noise or smelled any of today's wars, great tribulations were announced to you. You also know that not 2 years have passed since I told you, behold the sword of the Lord falling on the earth quickly and swiftly. Not I, but God predicted it to you. And look, it has come to pass, and it is here." Right? So what he's describing is what my political science colleagues would just refer to as regime change, right? Well, somebody had power and they don't anymore. Somebody else has power. So that's one way to describe this event. But look at the difference between the way my political science colleagues would describe it and the way Savonarola describes it, right? This is no mere regime change. This is the manifestation of God's will, and it's evidence of God's plan to punish the corrupt, right? So the symbolism of the French invasion, the importance it takes on within the apocalyptic imagination, that's what's interesting, I think, right? So what Savonarola sees in Charles VIII, he sees a second Charlemagne, right? He sees a figure who can reunite Italy under a purified Catholic Church, and then once the church is purified, once the sinners have been smited, well, you can head east and start converting infidels there and create a Christian world. All right. So this is a well-established prophetic tradition. So this is something that Savonarola's audience, they would have understood this, right? The idea of the French king as a second Charlemagne, somebody to unify the Christian world. This is, Savonarola says, I predicted this, right? So look at the difference, right? Look at the different stories we can tell ourselves about the same event. A political scientist says, well, it's a regime change. look, I can tell you a causal story about the economic and social factors that led to this effect, right? Now look, look at the way Savonarola tells the story, though. He tells a very different story. It's gods and kings, and it's all just rife with divine significance and apocalyptic imagery, right? So I think that's really interesting, right? And so I just want to give you kind of a flavor of what these sermons, what they felt like, what they sounded like, and what they would have meant to somebody who was sitting in the audience. I can't recreate that entirely, but just want to give you like a little bit of like a whiff of that. All right. Now, I mentioned, I'll get to Machiavelli here in a second, but I mentioned that Savonarola ultimately found himself at the head of the Republican regime, right? So the Medici, the very people that Savonarola has been criticizing, and he's been predicting their downfall, well, it came to pass, right? But it came to pass with Savonarola's own assistance, right? So there's a certain kind of irony or something that might make you kind of cock your eyebrow here. And that's that Savonarola had a hand in making his own prophecies come true. He helped to bring into being the very events which he had foretold in his sermons years earlier, right? So anybody who understands Machiavelli's concept of virtue, here's a nice kind of point of entry, right, for understanding the why Machiavelli would have been interested in Savonarola and why he might have associated Savonarola with the people that he associated him with. All right. Okay. So much for Savonarola. I want to move on to the second thing now. I just want to talk a little bit about Machiavelli's treatment of Savonarola. Okay. So Machiavelli only mentions Savonarola once in The Prince. And so you might say, well, he doesn't really care about Savonarola. He's not very interested in him. Maybe that's true, right? But just consider counterfactually, maybe it's not true. We'll examine that possibility, okay? So Machiavelli, one of the reasons I think Savonarola might be important for Machiavelli is where he mentions him. So Machiavelli mentions Savonarola in chapter 6. Chime in if you've read The Prince. You can't raise your hands, I guess, but just say aye if you've read The Prince.
Aye.
Aye. Some.
Okay, some, that works. Okay, so a few of you. So chapter 6 is really important. In The Prince. It's one of the most important chapters, probably along with like 15 and 25. So chapter 6 is on new princes. It's about founders of new regimes. So it's about people who give form to matter. All right. So it's kind of, they inherit like nothing. All right. And then they create a regime, so to speak, out of nothing. There was chaos, and then a founder steps in and establishes order. So only new princes do that, right? And there are very few new princes. And so you'll notice that among the new princes that Machiavelli mentions, they're the greatest founders. They're founders of peoples, all right? So Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus, right? The founders of the Jews, the Persian Empire, Rome, Athens, the great civilizations. So Machiavelli classes Savonarola with these figures. So Savonarola's in pretty tall cotton here. So we'll look at the quote. If Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long, as happened in our time to Fra Gerolamo Savonarola, who was ruined with his new order of things immediately. The multitude believed in him no longer, and he had no means of keeping steadfast those who believed, or of making the unbelievers to believe. So Machiavelli, you'll notice that there is a kind of, this is a very qualified assessment of Savonarola, right? On the one hand, he classes him as a new prince, and that certainly suggests that he admires him, right? But you'll note that that admiration is tempered by an awareness of Savonarola's mistake. Savonarola's founding, the new orders, the new society that he tried to introduce, it didn't last. And it didn't last because he wasn't armed. He was unarmed, right? Moses was armed, Cyrus was armed, Theseus was armed, and Romulus was armed, right? And so their foundings lasted, but Savonarola's didn't because he was unarmed. And so once people got tired of his, diatribes and him yelling at them, once they got tired of him, they turned on him and they hanged him in the town square. So that's actually what happened to him. He was hanged before his body was burned in the town square. There's some interesting stories about Savonarola's death, but I'll save those for another time. Okay, so this is the only place where Machiavelli mentions Savonarola, and so you'll see it's a kind of an ambiguous comment. On the one hand, he seems to admire him, but on the other hand, he recognizes he made mistakes, and these mistakes led to his downfall. Okay, so Machiavelli criticizes Savonarola for making mistakes, but I think the criticism implies admiration in a certain way for Savonarola's ability to control people with rhetoric. So Savonarola was unarmed. And given the fact that he was unarmed, it's actually amazing that he kept people in his thrall for as long as he did. His rhetoric was really powerful. And his ability to control people with rhetoric was really important, really significant. And so this might be one reason why we might expect to see Machiavelli adopting some of Savonarola's rhetorical tropes in The Prince, right? He clearly thinks that they're powerful, that they're effective. And if they can move people, if they can persuade people, why wouldn't Machiavelli adopt them too? Whether he believes them or not is maybe something we can talk about. But he clearly admires the effectiveness of these kinds of rhetorical tropes. So let's talk about his appropriation of them. All right, and this is the last thing we'll talk about, and then we can kind of open it up. So Machiavelli's use of these apocalyptic tropes is most evident in the last chapter of The Prince. So this last chapter is notoriously weird and puzzling for interpreters. It's titled An Exhortation to Free Italy from the Barbarians, or something like that. I don't have the book in front of me. But basically, it's an exhortation for somebody, anybody, to deliver Italy from her despoiled present, her corrupt present, her divided president, to unite Italy and move forward. So what we see in this last chapter, there's a noticeable rhetorical shift throughout the book. Those of you who read it know that Machiavelli's rhetorical style in the book is really plain, it's really straightforward, but there's this shift in chapter 26. He goes from this really cold, calculated advice about how to maintain rule. He shifts from that to this really high-flown, romantic, and even kind of like religious register. So there's this rhetorical shift, and it's noticeable, and it's really strange. And you go, well, what's going on here? Well, I think we can, understanding that he's appropriating some of these apocalyptic tropes is kind of an interesting way to read this chapter. So one of the ways that I kind of see these tropes working their way into the last chapter is that he begins chapter 26 by echoing chapter six's examples of new princes, right? So he doesn't mention Savonarola by name, but he puts Savonarola in our mind by returning to Moses, to Cyrus, to Theseus, to Romulus, and then by extension to Savonarola, right? So it's in the second paragraph. Machiavelli is basically suggesting that the time is right for somebody to come along and imitate the examples of these great founders. All right. So the things are lining up perfectly for that brave soul who will step forward and take advantage of this occasion. Right. So he says, and if, as I said, it was necessary that the people of Israel should be captive so as to make manifest the ability of Moses, that the Persians should be oppressed so as to discover the greatness of soul of Cyrus, that the Athenians should be dispersed to illustrate the capabilities of Theseus, then at the present time, in order to discover the virtue of an Italian spirit, it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to the extremity she is now in. So Machiavelli is basically saying things may seem bad, but the silver lining is the conditions are perfect for a redeemer prince, a transformational political figure to step into this power vacuum and to unite Italy, right? So you'll notice here that this is not just a call for order. It's not even a call for justice. It's a call for redemption. It's a call for somebody who can justify and make sense of Italy's past suffering, and maybe just as importantly, someone who can deliver them from it. Now, this is exactly what Savonarola did, right? I mean, this rhetorical strategy, the way that he described Italy's political events, he situated them in a larger context that gave them meaning. He helped to weave a narrative that helped Florentines interpret their experiences, not only as empirical events, not only as regime changes, but as intimations of the divine, right? So here I think is one kind of subtle way that Machiavelli is playing on some of these apocalyptic rhetorical tropes. He's calling for a redeemer figure, right? And the Italian people are waiting, right? Just like the Jewish people are waiting, just like Christians are waiting for a final judgment. All right. So that's one thing. Another thing, moving forward a few paragraphs, in addition to suggesting that kind of the time is right for this new Redeemer Prince, Machiavelli also does something that's really weird for him. He starts to suggest that natural events have divine significance, and this is his way of suggesting that an effort to reunify Italy would be favored by God, right? So look at what he says, and this is just, if you've read The Prince, this stuff like this is just so weird. He says, further than this, how extraordinarily the ways of God have been manifested beyond example. The sea is divided, a cloud has led the way, the rock has poured forth water, it has rained manna, everything has contributed to your greatness. You ought to do the rest. God is not willing to do everything, and thus take away our free will and that share of glory which belongs to us, right? And so here again, we've got an apocalyptic trope, and one that's just really odd in Machiavelli's mouth. The idea that God is like signaling the elect through natural signs. He's trying to call forth this prince redeemer figure. So he's signaling the elect through these natural signs as well as through visions and dreams. Here again, this is a Savonarolan rhetorical trope. It's an apocalyptic rhetorical trope. And it's one that Machiavelli seems to me clearly to be playing with. What his reason would be for doing that, I think, is open to question. And maybe that's something we can talk about. In fact, why don't we go ahead and talk about it among other things, because that's really all that I've got. I think I went too long as it is. So I'll unshare. And so that's that. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know. What do you make of the end of the world?
All right, so I'm going to keep this to 15 minutes if that's okay with everybody. I won't adjust the time for the Q&A unless we need to. So, does anybody have any questions or comments for Dr. Warner and his presentation?
I
I
think the idea of chapter 26 of Machiavelli kind of appropriating some of those rhetorical tropes can be, I see a lot of that in the current, I guess it's always kind of present in whatever political climate you're in, but it's easy to imagine him in a situation like we're at now, saying, the time's ripe, like we're here for a regime change. All it takes is someone willing to do the work. And it seems like there is a lot of that. It hasn't been expressly said in that way, but I feel like that's in a lot of people's minds right now, one way or another.
I think it's really interesting, and I couldn't help as I was thinking about the unprecedented level of just sheer chaos in our society right now. It's not, you guys haven't been around, and I've been around a little longer, and Dr. Johnson, I don't, speaking for myself, there's nothing even remotely close in my lifetime. Nothing resembles this, right? I mean, we have a pandemic, we have racial tension that we haven't seen in 60 years. We've got all kinds of other stuff going on too. And so this broad climate of instability, it's ripe for apocalyptic interpretation, right? So you can look at all this stuff. You could look at the pandemic, and you could say this is somehow the hand of God in history, right? It's a divine eruption into secular time. You can look at these racial tensions and give those a kind of a biblical, or apocalyptic interpretation, that this is some form of transcendent moral reckoning. At any rate, yeah, I think you're right. There's just so much crazy stuff going on right now, that I don't know, do you? I mean, I don't know what the question is exactly, but it certainly seems like the instability of the times just lends itself to an apocalyptic interpretation, right? So I don't know. How do you guys sort of see that going on out there? That's for anybody.
I think we're pretty easy.
You can unmute yourselves.
I think we're pretty quick to sometimes put ourselves into a timeline bubble, especially now, again, when looking relatively within the past 100 years, yeah, times are pretty crazy, but if we are quick to associate, end of the world, and I mean, it seems like every 100 years or so we're faced with a society that it very much could be interpreted, whether that's from any standpoint, oh, it's the end of the world. We've got a pandemic and racial tensions, it's the end of the world. Europe in the, 10s and 40s, it's all this crazy stuff with Germany, it's the end of the world. I think we have to be careful that we aren't quick to say our extreme circumstances are completely isolated and completely unique. I think they might be unique to us. And, this is not if we, 9 million Jews were gassed, our times shouldn't be taken seriously or impactful, because it maybe is the worst thing that we've experienced as a society. But I just think we have to be careful before we head too far down it's the end of the world, we're completely in trouble, whatever.
Good.
That's all I've got on that. But I do have.
Good.
have a quick comment on Machiavelli.
Oh yeah.
So I do think it's interesting. I think a lot of times, and especially my initial reaction to reading The Prince is like, it's anti-virtuous. It seems to very much be like sacrifice virtue in order for the sake of progress. And I was reading some of Bertrand Russell's work, and he talks about how it seems less like Machiavelli was trying to devalue virtue and more trying to make you aware of what the enemy will be using. And if you want to be virtuous, that's completely fine. Machiavelli, I don't think is saying you should be unvirtuous. You should never strive for virtue in any circumstances. I think he's saying you can be virtuous, but only to a certain point, only to the point where it's not going to cost you progress. Because if you think that acquiring the greatest amount of progress will produce the greatest results, then it would be irresponsible of you to not otherwise do so. And I think from that perspective, I don't know that I completely agree with Russell, and it's unfortunate that we can't ask Machiavelli, obviously, but I think it makes...
Don't worry, he wouldn't tell us if he were here.
But I at least think it makes that last quote make a little more sense, at least from that viewpoint. Whether it's correct or not, I mean, is extremely arguable, but it's just interesting.
Yeah, sure. I didn't know Russell had that view of the Prince that sort of broadly aligns with Rousseau's interpretation. Rousseau is the first person that I'm aware of who had this interpretation of the Prince, that the Prince was not a book for princes, it was a book for peoples. So it was a book so people could understand how nefarious and bad their rulers were, and this should inspire them to rise up and rule themselves.
And Rousseau and Bale definitely had a much more optimistic view of Machiavelli's work. Russell's is more, hey, it's intended to be shocking. You can't really help but be shocked when you read this, but I don't think that Machiavelli is necessarily saying that you should completely devalue virtue. Or at least that's what I understood some of his writings to mean.
You have to pretend like you like it, at least.
Yeah.
Let's go to Austin now, because Austin, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about how you were talking about how certain, like, the new princes were equipped to, like, handle their situation. That's what led them to success. So I was thinking a lot about Muhammad and, like, the tools he was kind of equipped with to start out growing a religion and then later building that religion into a state and an empire. So you kind of got the wheels turned in my head.
Okay. I don't know. Did you have more thoughts there? I'm not I know about as little about Muhammad as it's possible to know.
Right, that's what my project is on, so that's kind of where my mind went to during that.
Oh, well, cool. Can you unpack that? Maybe if other people have already listened to your spiel, maybe you can get through it quickly.
Yeah, for sure. So I really want to focus on how the idea of the apocalypse and apocalyptic ideas were used to kind of grow the religion in its early stages and even throughout its history into the modern day. So I was thinking of that maybe as like a tool, like something he had in his toolbox in order to influence people and to achieve his political and cultural goals.
Well, and I think sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, and it definitely, I think, when viewed from a more institutional standpoint, I think it could be interesting to kind of view the relationship, how much of Muhammad or the Christian churches, how much of that was genuine. I genuinely think that the end of the world is nigh, that you need to be prepared for it, and how much of it was designed for control. So I know in like the 18 and 1900s, kind of when, I can't remember the name of the movement, basically objectivism versus subjectivism, absolute truth or not, the Pope came out and said, hey, relativism, there is no relativism, there's only absolute truth. And it could just be interesting to observe, what claims made by institutionalized religion are genuine and which ones are maybe to kind of preserve some unity. I just think that it's an interesting question.
So I can kind of speak to this a little bit. Historically, I feel pretty safe in making the following generalization, that apocalyptic pastors and apocalyptic messages are usually exist at the fringes of religious movements. And so Savonarola was an upstart. He was a populist in a lot of ways. He was a kind of upstart pastor. He cut his own way to political power. I think this is one of the reasons why Machiavelli really admires him, is because he manages to come to power without owing anybody anything. He does it independently. Now he doesn't have arms, and so the whole thing kind of founders. But at any rate, this goes back to, you can go back to kind of apocalyptic preaching, even in the kind of around the founding of Christianity, right? Is that there were a lot of people preaching fire and brimstone, and the early Christian church was trying to throw a wet blanket on that as quickly as possible. And so what you end up with, like, I'm thinking of Augustine and I'm thinking of Paul in particular, is that they try to neutralize these apocalyptic messages as quickly as they can, because they understand how destabilizing they are. This kind of same pattern gets repeated in 16th and 17th century England. You have a lot of fire and brimstone pastors who were at the fringes, the radical, ends of those societies. And the institutional church is trying to, again, neutralize these messages in the name of order, in the name of, justice and whatever else. And so usually when these apocalyptic tropes rise to prominence, it's not because the major institutions have authorized that. Actually, it's in spite of the efforts of, the kind of conventional religious institutions and so forth. So it's actually like a very interesting question.
Yeah, and just to add to what Dr. Warner said, I think like in the Gospel of John, it's either with Peter or another disciple. Like Jesus says to them, like, you'll be here, you'll still be living, or you will still be here when I return. So then a lot of Christians thought, like, oh, that means that disciple is never going to die and Jesus is going to return really soon. And then the author of John literally says, but that's not what Jesus meant. So it's kind of interesting to see how it's not just a phenomenon that all religious people, right, want the world to end. And even like in the early movements when the church was growing, they didn't really use the apocalyptic strategy to get everybody on their side. It seems to be kind of like a cheap way to get people quickly on your side and acquire power. Yeah. And
incidentally, about Savonarola, Machiavelli took for granted that Savonarola was just play acting. I mean, he thought Savonarola was a liar. He makes this clear in personal correspondence. He just says, well, he just tells lies and adapts with the times, and like he's good at it, right? And I think you could read that and go, oh, Machiavelli thinks Savonarola is just a fraud. But on the other hand, Machiavelli respects fraud when it's done well, right? So, he respects a good grift. And so it's, here it just kind of, just reiterates the question of, what Machiavelli's attitude here is it's complicated. But anyway, yeah.
All right, so we have 30 seconds left. If you have a final comment or question, feel free to ask.